are watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, great to be back alongside you.
It is great to be back alongside you, Eugene. Be careful with your coffee, please.
Yes. Inside joke. I'm not even going to dignify that by allowing our audience to know what you are referring to. But since I'm a positive person, great to see your rapidly evolving, nice-looking background. That's what I'll say there. Big shout-out, of course, to everyone who is tuned in. Great to have you with us, as always. I will remind those of you who are watching on YouTube, now would be as good a time as any to go ahead and hit that subscribe button and use that down arrow. Make sure you got the alerts on so that you can be alerted to the things that you have subscribed to, and you don't have to look very far. We've got a lot of great stuff coming out on a regular basis, including dispatches with Rania Khalek. So you wouldn't want to have to work hard to find all of that fantastic content. And if you hit subscribe, hit that down arrow, turn on your notifications, you won't have to do so. And of course, for those who are watching on Free Speech TV, big shout out to you. No need to do anything other than keep watching and supporting Free Speech TV. And a big shout out to the whole FSTV team for making it possible for us to appear there as well. Rania, are there other things you would like our audience to know?
Yes, Eugene. I want to remind everybody to, in addition to liking, subscribing, and sharing this episode, because all of that helps boost us in the algorithm, which hates us. If you support independent media like Breakthrough News and oppose our algorithmic corporate overlords who are trying to suppress our content, please consider supporting our work here by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News and becoming a Breakthrough News member. For as little as $5 a month, you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch like this very lovely Breakthrough News mug. Just be careful if you have it around your computer, not to accidentally there's gonna be a karmic punishment for me continuing to mock you for this, so I should stop.
Yes.
But yeah, you can access very cool merch, such as the mug Eugene is currently very carefully drinking out of. And most importantly, you can support independent media. Breakthrough News is, I know I'm biased because I am a part of Breakthrough News, but I feel very strongly that our content is more important than ever amidst a nonstop tsunami of pro-genocide, pro-imperialist propaganda. And so in order to continue growing here at Breakthrough News, we need your support. So patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And if you want to make a one-time donation, you can do that in the live chat on YouTube, or you can go to breakthroughnews.org, where you can also find written content, which we've recently launched, really, really excellent written reporting that you should definitely go check out as well.
Yeah, a lot of fantastic stuff. And, no hard feelings about the coffee thing, Rania, since I did reveal to the audience in the past your favorite musical was Hamilton. So, just to...
he libels because he loves...
It's true, although that's also true. A lot of true things in those statements. Nonetheless, let's get the show going here before Rania and I reveal something really embarrassing about each other. We got a lot of great stuff for you all around the world. We want to start here in the United States, and of course, we are right on the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, which of course was such a seminal event in so many different ways. And we are very, very honored to be joined here in the show by Jordan Flaherty, who is a New Orleans-based journalist, film producer, and very important for this conversation, author of the book Floodlines: Community Resistance from Hurricane Katrina to the Gina 6. Jordan, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's an honor to have you, and very excited that your book is out and with us here. Super important. And in a way, I wanted to start a little bit with the title, because you say community and resistance from Hurricane Katrina to the Gina 6. And I think when we're remembering the history of the storm and everything that came out of it, of course, we remember so much of the human tragedy and pain that was caused by this. But also there was a huge amount of creative community resilience and resistance and attempts to push back against the other attempts to reshape New Orleans and Louisiana after this. So, I guess I just wonder, maybe top line, 20 years on, what do you think we have to really learn from what happened in Hurricane Katrina and where we've come since?
In so many ways, Katrina was a warning. And right now, it often feels like we're under attack in so many ways, the social safety net, the democracy, if we even ever had a democracy, all of these things. And after Hurricane Katrina, it also felt like we were attacked in all these ways simultaneously. Everywhere people are facing issues of housing, healthcare, education. But after Hurricane Katrina, it was like on hyperspeed. So we had overnight, the entire staff of the school system, 7,500 teachers were fired. Their union, the largest union in the city, ceased to be recognized. The school system went from under control of some form of democratic governance, the local school board, to being moved over to charter. All of this happened overnight, right? People are fighting on education everywhere, but it was so sudden, so fast in New Orleans. Similarly, in housing, 80% of the housing was damaged. Almost all of the public housing was shut down, even the undamaged public housing, overnight. You had the governor saying, I'm sending in National Guard troops. They're locked and loaded. They've been trained to shoot to kill, and I expect they will. Again, feels so much like today. Our public free hospital was shut down overnight. So we were facing all of this quickly, but we had incredible organizing. Organizing really led by those most affected in the city who were fighting against all of this. And I think what I talk about is, yes, the problems we face, but also the really inspiring organizing. And I feel like I learned so much from living in New Orleans. I moved here a couple of years before Hurricane Katrina, and it's changed my life in so many ways.
I mean, it's really amazing to look back on this horrific moment and see how nothing has been learned, because there's been so many natural disasters afterwards that have gone horribly. So I guess I'm just curious, as we're a couple decades out from this awful hurricane and the negligence of the U.S. government in responding to it, what's the situation today? How many, when it comes to hurricanes, is there new levels of preparation? Because it seems like every time there's a hurricane, you see a kind of, maybe not as bad as Katrina, but similar disasters play out over and over that are preventable, and nothing's being done to mitigate that.
Well, in the last 20 years, I think we all learned to look at Kanye West differently. But aside from that, I think there were some advances made in FEMA, but also they ended up, just this week, the federal government has been gutting FEMA. So much of why New Orleans is at risk is because of the oil and gas industry, which of course is getting, more support from the federal government than ever before right now. Part of what made us unsafe is, of course, climate change, the hurricanes getting larger, the hurricane season lasting longer, the hurricanes getting stronger. But also you had the oil and gas industry pipes in South Louisiana bringing salt water into the freshwater marshes, causing coastal erosion. About a football field of land every 45 minutes lost from the Louisiana coast. We've literally lost an area the size of Delaware from the Louisiana coast. And those mostly uninhabited areas that sunk into the ocean now are, putting us in more damage. And I want to say, and putting at more risk, I want to say it's, not totally uninhabited. There's a lot of indigenous tribes in that area, like the Pointe-au-Chien tribe, that are now being made climate refugees because of that disappearing land. So we also, living in New Orleans, we're right near Cancer Alley, where a lot of these oil and gas processing are. It's a beautiful, amazing life here, but we also live a shorter life by living in New Orleans, and we live a life with less economic opportunities. People here are still making the federal minimum wage, if that. There's a lot of wage theft, and meanwhile, housing prices, costs of living continue to go up.
It felt so poignant in a way when Mahmoud Khalil was moved into detention. It was in Gina, Louisiana, and I can remember so vividly being in Gina around the Gina 6 and that great issue of racial injustice and oppression. And it feels like there's sort of a cross-pollination. I mean, different issues, different times, different pieces. But, I wonder seeing that, how that struck you, because I remember it just really struck me in a powerful way, that symbolism of that place and these issues, and thinking about the 18 or so years that separates us.
Yeah, so I included Gina 6 in that book, and I was the first journalist with a national audience to write about that case of the Gina 6, and I spent a lot of time with those families over a period of years. And I think it's a really important struggle, first of all, because these organizers from New Orleans who have been fighting for justice in Katrina went to Gina to fight for those families. From the beginning, people in New Orleans had, a national perspective, an international perspective. People's Hurricane Relief Fund, one of the main organizations that was in the grassroots struggle. From the very beginning, they had their symbol, the symbol of the key, which, Palestinians used for the right of return, and they were using it to represent their right of return, the very same key. You also had literally an Israeli company called Instinctive Shooting International that was brought in after Hurricane Katrina to protect wealthy neighborhoods. So from the very beginning, we knew that this struggle was not just about New Orleans, but was, a national struggle, an international struggle. And when those families in Gina called out for help, people from New Orleans went and joined. And, not just organizers, but there was a whole bus organized by poets from New Orleans that went to Gina for that large march. And, not everybody knows this, probably a lot of people don't know this, but, those 6 young men, because of that massive struggle that people waged, they were all freed. They all went to college instead of being in jail. One of them is a public defender. He went to law school as well. And that's because of the efforts of people from New Orleans, people from around the South, people from around the country that fought to free those 6 high school students that were facing life in prison for a school fight.
Mm-hmm.
Jordan, I'm curious. I have a nephew who's 21, and it always blows my mind when he asks me questions like, "What's Hurricane Katrina?" Because that's not something that is really etched in the memories of people who were, toddlers or not born yet. So I'm curious if you could just kind of speak to the significance of what happened back then. And I know you're talking a lot about why it still matters today, but let's say to a younger generation of people who maybe, weren't watching the news or weren't even around yet. Why does this still matter today? And what should they understand about that event in history?
I have for a long time had a very cynical view of the US government, but even I was surprised being in New Orleans as the water rose and seeing that there was no help for people, and knowing that if New Orleans was not a majority African-American city, there would have been help. And this is a city that is responsible for so much of the culture internationally. So much of music was born in New Orleans, whether it's jazz, the music of Congo Square in New Orleans. So much of that reverberated and so much of it echoed across the world. And to see that happen, to be there and see it happen, to see the city underwater, to see how the media were treating the people of New Orleans, to see the media would say Black people were looting and white people were finding food, right? You had the police violence. You had, in addition to what I said about the governor, you had the second in charge of the police department telling officers they could do whatever they want. They went out shooting James Brissett, a young 17-year-old who was just crossing from his flooded home over the Danziger Bridge with several other survivors. Police just came out shooting. It turned out later they thought they were someone else, and they shot him. They shot Ronald Madison, a mentally challenged man. They killed both of them. They wounded several others. They killed Henry Glover. Police killed Henry Glover and hid the body. They killed Danny Brumfield Sr., who was just standing outside of the convention center. So you had all of this happen. It was laid out so clearly how much the U.S. government does not care about the people of this country, and especially poor people in this country, and especially people of color in this country, especially Black people in this country. And you saw it in the Reconstruction too, the way that the money that was supposed to go to rebuild the city never arrived. You had, I often say it was like the sky was filled with money, but it was just out of reach. You had literally billions of dollars that were supposed to go for the reconstruction of the city. And then they went to cronies of the Bush administration, the presidency at that time, Kellogg, Brown and Root, Halliburton, Blackwater, all of them got money, but the people most in need did not get money. Out of the 25 nonprofits that got the most donations, half of them were not based in the Gulf Coast. So you had, whether it's in the mainstream, whether it's in progressive world, this money that was meant for the people of New Orleans did not go to the people of New Orleans.
And on that note of Reconstruction, I mean, I'm sure many people remember, obviously, the mass displacement that took place. And I wonder, 20 years on, I mean, how many people were able to come back? What role has gentrification played in the Reconstruction? I mean, how has sort of the physical plant, if you will, perhaps, of the city been shaped in the interim?
There were around 480,000 people living in New Orleans before Hurricane Katrina. Today, there are 360,000. So roughly 120,000 less people. And there's actually almost exactly 120,000 less African Americans in the city. So the people that were displaced were mostly Black people from the city. Went from a city that was 68% Black to 56% Black. People were displaced. It became a city much more hostile to poor people. It was always a city that was hostile to poor people, but it was more hostile. And just in the recovery, for example, the Road Home program, which was a state administered, federal funded program of billions of dollars to rebuild the city. First of all, it was only for homeowners. So renters, homeless people, they got no money. And even among renters, white families got on average 35% more money than Black families. So every aspect of the Reconstruction was tilted against people of color, was tilted against Black people, was tilted against poor people.
And of course, this was also happening at a time when the U.S. was embarking on its massive, horrific war on terror that just was a killing spree all across the Middle East. And you were kind of making a point earlier between the ways the response in Katrina is connected with the way the U.S. responds to the world. And I'm just curious if you could just expand a little bit on that, because I think it's really important to recognize the ways that the Black population in New Orleans, particularly the poor Black population, was subjected to kind of like an empire turning inwards.
Yeah, I always think of poet Suhair Hamad that wrote a poem at the time about it. And she, Palestinian American poet, it had the final words where the rest of the world lives here too in America. And I think, there's that term of how these policies that start with countries that were colonizing eventually come to the colonized people in the U.S. And we're definitely seeing that here in the U.S. Today, that the mask is off. The U.S. is completely willing to use these policies against people in the U.S. They don't want any of us to be able to go to school. They don't want any of us to be safe from going hungry. They don't want any of us to have health care. They want to tear it all down, and they don't want to build anything in this place. They just want bunkers for the rich and genocide for the people that stand in their way.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot to wrestle with, a lot to remember, and a lot of positive things in the midst of all the negative. And so that's why I hope people are able to read your book, Floodlines, Community and Resistance from Hurricane Katrina to the Gina 6. Jordan Flaherty, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much. I can't emphasize enough. There's incredible organizing here. There's so much to learn from people like Norris Henderson that I talk about in my book, Dion Haywood. I know you have to go, but I encourage people to look to the incredible organizers in New Orleans. There's so much to learn from them here. Thank you for your work.
No, absolutely. Rania?
Well, Eugene, my God, that was such a crazy thing to be basically like a young adult for a teenager watching Hurricane Katrina take place. And I love that he mentioned Kanye West, because the reason he mentioned Kanye West for the young ones who are watching is that Kanye West called out George W. Bush in a pretty significant way, basically called him racist on national TV. And unfortunately, since then, Kanye West has gone a different route. But he said the truth. He said the truth at the time because, yeah, we just like the country just watched Black people die and then called them all looters and criminals. And it was just pure neglect. It was so disgusting. And it's like to come, to see over 20 years later, like the fact that not only has nothing been learned, but, the amount of hurricanes that have taken place afterwards and just the same pattern of neglect and trying to use those kinds of disasters as an opportunity to like gentrify and reshape cities to get rid of poor people, mostly poor people of color.
Yeah. I was there in September of that year, not that long after Hurricane Katrina. And the thing that really sticks with, there's a lot of things stick with me the most. One of the things that sticks with me the most is that Blackwater, is still doing a lot of security. And so it was like the pictures that you saw from like Fallujah or whatever, these Blackwater guys rolling around in these little like buggies with automatic weapons and everything. It was crazy. And they were in charge of the food distribution in the lower Ninth Ward. It is a wild situation. But yeah, more stories for another time. But really appreciate Jordan coming on and joining us. We're going to move now to another critical situation, and that is, what I feel you could call U.S. threats against Venezuela and other countries in Latin America in terms of the deployment of a amphibious warfare flotilla into the Caribbean Sea there. We are very, very happy to be joined to continue our conversation on this topic and more by Manolo De Los Santos, who is the Executive Director of the People's Forum and a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, very august platform. Manolo, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you again for having me, Rania and Eugene.
Well, great to have you with us. I wonder how you're interpreting the U.S. moves here. They're sending, amphibious assault ships. They're sending the Marine Expeditionary Force, all of the people who basically advertise themselves as invasion forces, but they're selling this as some sort of law enforcement operation against cartels in South America. Is this just trying to protect the children of America against the inflow of drugs, or is this something a little more sinister, Manolo?
Well, I would clearly say that it has nothing to do with the so-called war on drugs, which for people living in the United States, we've known has been a farce in our own communities for 50 years now. This has much more to do with the fact that the Trump administration, the US government, is essentially making a full-on, full-scale assault on the independence of Latin American countries. They're contesting hegemony in the region, and they see a clear target, Venezuela, which in my opinion, continues to stand as not just one of the most sovereign countries in the region, but as a clear impediment to the U.S. designs to take control of the region.
Yeah, Manolo, it's like so insane. It's like the mob bosses are just getting it more and more insane. Can you talk a bit about, can you expand on, because we keep hearing this narco-state label. We hear these very specific numbers that Maduro is responsible for like this much, cocaine and $50 million bounty on his head over it. Can you actually talk about not just the fact that there's zero evidence that this narco-state label actually applies, but on top of that, it's the other way around. It's the U.S. that's largely involved in the drug trade across Latin America?
Well, when I talk about stats regarding this question, I always start with the fact that the US continues to be the world's largest consumer of drugs. I say that again, the world's largest consumer of drugs. And that the DEA itself, the Drug Enforcement Agency in the United States itself, recognizes how the networks that facilitate the US being the world's largest consumer are precisely within the US, within all 50 states. And they implicate in a series of people and entities across the US that never really get talked about. It's so much easier to talk about the threat of Venezuela without actually giving any specifics. And when I was looking recently at actually the DEA's own national threat reports, a report where they actually assess where is the threat of drugs incoming to the US from? And the reports for both 2024 and 2025 never mention at all this so-called Cartel de los Soles that is constantly now being mentioned by right-wing media in the United States. And to make it even bigger point, they don't really mention Venezuela either. In fact, the focus of the reports tends to be on cartels in Mexico, which we have known for some time depend greatly on their partners in the US, sometimes even partners within US agencies, government agencies. So, again, is it really about the facts? Is Venezuela really a threat? When we look at what's actually happening next door to Venezuela, in Colombia, which is, if not the largest, one of the largest producers of drugs in the region, it's a country where there are actually 7 US military bases that are particularly targeted towards so-called combating drugs. And there are 3 DEA offices in Colombia, yet the production of drugs in Colombia has only increased. So, what is that to say about US priorities and what the real motive is behind threatening Venezuela?
You know, Manolo, since 1998, the broader political process in Venezuela has been known as the Bolivarian Revolution. And I think in the United States, not a lot of people know who Simón Bolívar is. But I was thinking about this in the context of what we've seen over the past few days, where people have been signing up for the militia to fight, if necessary, if the country is invaded. And that spoke so much to me about, you know, cutting through the demonization, what has been happening since 1998 in Venezuela, and the issues of sovereignty, not just of Venezuela, but of Latin America, that are so deeply at the root of this historical process and that are so offensive to people that they would sign up to potentially, you know, fight and defend their country. And I don't know really exactly where I'm going with this, but I was hoping you could just talk about that, because I just think it's a sort of an interesting commentary on, you know, beyond the propaganda, why Venezuela has had this process since 1998 that, despite so many threats and so many screws turned against it, has not fallen.
Eugene, I'm so glad you raised 1998 because it's a pivotal year. It's the beginning of a complete transformation inside Venezuelan society around something that the US cares a lot about, which is oil, Venezuela's natural resources. Venezuela has, as of now, the largest proven reserves of oil. Over 303 billion barrels of oil are estimated to be under Venezuelan soil. And in 1998, and since then, the Venezuelan people who've taken power in their country have essentially decided that the wealth produced by this oil and by their other mineral resources are meant to stay at home and develop their own country. They're no longer meant to just flow north in direction to the US to make certain billionaires in Texas and in Washington, D.C. filthy rich. And that has actually created a situation that has pit US foreign policy directly and frontally against Venezuela since 1998 for one reason or another. And I think, you know, when people today in Venezuela, across the political spectrum, actually, not just people on the left, see their country being threatened by US military forces reaching their shores, the majority response of people, again, across the political spectrum, left to right, has been defend the homeland, defend their country, defend their resources, because that is what has allowed the country, whether one likes it or not, to chart its own path, to chart its own future, and to secure the well-being of its people, which contrasts with everything that took place before 1998, when you could say Venezuela was nothing more than a neo-colony of the United States.
And then, Manolo, can you talk a bit about the way that sanctions play a role, kind of, you know, reinforcing this hybrid war? I mean, you have the whole military threat under the guise of fighting drugs. But for a long time, Venezuela has not been allowed to prosper because the U.S. has enforced these really suffocating sanctions to try to basically rig, or I'm sorry, it's very late for me, so I'm like stumbling on words, but has basically tried to place many obstacles in the way of Venezuela's socialism succeeding.
Well, I think going back to history is important for us because what we're seeing now, in a sense, is not new. It's simply another development in the long process of US hybrid war, as you mentioned, against Venezuela. I mean, we go back to 2002, 2003, 2005. And since then, we've seen everything from coups sponsored by the US government to overthrow a democratically elected government. We have seen assassination attempts against its political leaders. We have seen all sorts of attacks. And the latest round being heavy sanctions, particularly after 2014 and 2015, which have essentially strangled the Venezuelan economy, particularly its ability to sell oil on the global market. And the US single-handedly, I would say, created a situation where Venezuela's economy plummeted overnight because of the lack of resources coming from oil sales. Over the years, Venezuela has tried to recover, it has had to diversify its economy. But the fact is that US sanctions have had a terrible impact on Venezuelan society beyond just its economy. There are recent reports, in fact, by CEPR, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, that were pointing out that over the last few years, US sanctions, not just on Venezuela, but on majority of countries around the world, have caused over 500 deaths on an annual basis. Many of those deaths in Venezuela itself. So I think the other thing to just mention, because I think it's important for understanding our narrative, is that the United States has never really cared about Venezuela. All it cares is about taking control of Venezuela's resources, its oil, its minerals, its gold. And over the years, it's had to change its narrative. It's had to change the message. Over a few years, it was that the US was supposedly concerned with defending democracy. All of a sudden, it's made a real sort of veer to the right and sort of said, well, democracy is not so important for us in Venezuela. What really matters is that the Venezuelans are involved in the drug trade. No one in Latin America believes this joke. The Mexican president openly said there is no legitimacy to these claims. The Colombian president has also denounced this. It's almost clear to anyone with common sense that Trump is talking out of his ass. So is the United States government.
Well, I think one of the things that's also important to note here is that Venezuela, despite all of these challenges and threats against it, has not changed either its internal domestic policies or its international policies to conform with the United States. And I mean, it's continued to speak out, in defense of the Palestinian people and their right to exist. One of the very few countries in the region and in the world that oppose the MSS, sort of neo-colonial occupation of Haiti. I mean, Venezuela continues to stand as a beacon despite of anti-imperialism, some might say, despite all of this. And it seems like that also has to be getting under the skin of Trump and friends.
Well, I think the Venezuelans have learned very well from what's happened in the rest of the world, from looking at Libya, from looking at Iraq, from looking in other parts of the world. Making concessions to the US doesn't make you safer. Agreeing with the US does not make you safer. Saying yes to Trump doesn't make you less worthy of attacks by Trump himself and the US government. So I think they've taken the position of dignity, of defending their sovereignty, of being independent, regardless of what the cost may be. And I think they're right for doing so. And I think in doing so, they're giving an example to anyone else on the planet who wants to live free of the US empire.
And I also want to ask Manolo, in terms of solidarity, is Venezuela receiving any regional solidarity here, whether it's from institutions and alliances or specific countries?
Well, I think it's been interesting to see where the chips fall regarding Venezuela, because on one hand, you've seen again countries like Mexico, Colombia, others in the Caribbean who have stood out in defense of Venezuela's sovereignty and independence. China has come out and has forcefully defended Venezuela's sovereignty and independence. But you also have seen how some countries have stooped to the level of the US regime and essentially offered themselves to be launching pads for US intervention against Venezuela, like Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago. It's a shame that fellow Latin American countries, fellow members of the Caribbean, essentially, for what will ultimately be crumbs of whatever they can get from the US, essentially will be okay with a war that it's not just against Venezuela, but that would have major catastrophic implications for all of the region.
Well, a lot to watch here. This is a very dynamic situation. Obviously, the U.S. ships and troops are there and moving, so we'll continue to watch this, continue to follow this, and certainly we will bring you back, I'm sure, Manolo, to keep discussing this. Manolo De Los Santos of the People's Forum and Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.
Rania?
I appreciate that Manolo noted that submission does not lead to success. And it's definitely, I'm going to talk later in the show about what happened in Lebanon this week, especially with the Trump envoy to the region, Tom Barrack. And I have to say, you know, it's one thing that I really appreciate when I see, and I know there's Venezuelans, of course, who do want to collaborate with the U.S. and, you know, would be happy to see a pro-U.S. government and blame Maduro for everything. Of course, it exists in any country that, you know, opposes U.S. imperialism. But here in Lebanon, the situation is so polarized, and there are so many Lebanese who just want to roll out the red carpet for Lindsey Graham and Donald Trump. And it's just utterly shocking. And they really believe that just submission to the mafia empire will actually just lead to like prosperity. And there's so many examples of how untrue that is.
Yeah. Well, it'll lead to prosperity for you individually as the agent, the native agent of the imperial rule, but everyone else will be in big trouble. But yes, stick with us to get Rania Khalek's take on the latest in Lebanon. But now we want to move to another critically important issue, and that is the ongoing, you know, call it what you want, so-called law and order, you know, push by President Trump is just, well, I don't know. I don't want to editorialize too much, but nonetheless, the city of Chicago very much in the crosshairs there and has been rhetorically and perhaps even more so by the Trump administration, even before he was president. So very, very honored to have with us to discuss this Alderman Byron Cicho Lopez, who is the alderperson for the 25th Ward, also the chair of the Housing and Real Estate Committee in the city of Chicago. Alderman, thank you so much for being with us.
It's an honor to be here and good to see you. Thank you for the invitation.
No, thank you so much for accepting. And, you know, in some ways, I hate to even dignify some of what Trump's statements are, but I think, you know, perhaps it deserves to be said. I mean, he is claiming that Chicago is in some sort of, you know, mass criminal wave that's destroying everything and that there needs to be the National Guard and more police and federal takeover. How do you respond to his accusations about the state of things in the city of Chicago?
Well, if there's a regime that is destroying entire cities or country and other regions, is the Trump regime. It's not even an administration. Look at what's going on in the CDC. Looking what's going on with HUD, with the EPA, and just as you mentioned with your previous guest, the invasion of Latin American areas, which is to begin with the problem and how we have gotten so many people looking for refuge to begin with. So if anything, if you look at, you know, the sequence of events, the sanctions have created massive displacement, massive migration to our country. Trump is only doubling down on that. And then and I think what we got to talk about is occupation. Trump is occupying and normalizing the militarization of entire or of American cities, as he's trying to normalize the militarization of entire regions. The genocide in the Middle East, we see in Latin America, the destabilization of democracies, and the imposition of dictatorships, the collaboration of with dictators like Bukele. So if anyone can be blamed directly for the current conditions and the worsening of the situation is Donald Trump. I think here in Chicago, what I'll say is that they have found, these fascist Gestapo operators that have come and descended in cities like Chicago, LA, and DC, have found a well-informed, well-organized city, a labor town, a union town, that is ready to take and face on this dictator who is terrorizing not only abroad and continue to terrorize people abroad, but now they're bringing military and normalizing a dictatorship and militarizing American cities, something that we cannot normalize.
Byron, as Donald Trump has, of course, is threatening to deploy the National Guard in Chicago, there's also news today that ICE is asking for permission to use a Chicago Navy base as a launching pad for a deportation crackdown. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on there and why that's incredibly dangerous?
Well, it is the dangerous situation where we're living here in Chicago, with basically a few months ago on June 4th, we had a Gestapo operation with masked men descending in our city and basically kidnap mainly women in our community in an operation that was made headlines. But more than anything else, it was the beginning of testing the ground, pushing the envelope. And I think that what we see now is demands of collaboration with military bases. They're trying to basically test the grounds and push the envelopes to normalize militarized zones, to normalize masked men coming and kidnapping neighbors, coming in schools. We in our community at the end of last school year in June, we have ICE agents coming and setting up shop in a laundromat right next to a school at the last day of school, doing dismissal at 3 p.m., which terrorized an entire community. So what we're seeing is they don't respect constitutional rights. They have come to businesses without warrants, playing dumb to say what is private, what is public. Well, suit me later. So I think that what we see in LA, in DC, and Chicago is the consolidation of what Trump wants to be is a dictatorship. He does not want another election. It's clear that what he's doing here in Chicago is unpopular. Nobody wants this to happen in any city. But we have seen, unfortunately, the lack of leadership also in the Democratic Party. Unfortunately, I'm glad to see Governor Pritzker, and I'm glad to see the mayor of Chicago pushing back and being a united front. But it's not enough. It's not enough because we need to make sure that there's no collaboration with the Chicago Police Department. We cannot allow them coming up and setting military bases. This military base, this Navy Marine base is out of Chicago, is in North Chicago. It's about an hour from us. But it certainly is going to push the envelope in accepting and normalizing militarization, occupation, and terror in our city, something that I think no one in Chicago wants. And I'm calling on every elected official, labor, faith leaders, all of us. This is working people versus billionaires. And I think in Chicago, we're fighting back in a time where our livelihoods are at stake.
No, I think that's so important. And I was hoping you could talk more about that, about the resistance that has been going on and that's continuing to go on. I mean, I know there's a march on Labor Day coming up and many other things and resolutions being introduced. Talk to us about what's happening on the ground, because I think, as you mentioned at the outset, Chicagoans are not sitting on their hands. People are pushing back, fighting back, and organizing.
Yes, well, one thing about Chicago, and we've seen that, during the DNC, we've seen it with this attempt to occupy, is Chicago stands up. Chicago is a union town. We are expecting massive mobilizations on September 1st, led by the Chicago Federation of Labor, the Chicago Teachers Union. So we are expecting massive mobilization of a united front. I think the dictator-in-chief is unifying our city, is unifying immigrant community, unifying us with labor. So what we need to make sure in this moment is that we do not comply, we not concede. We cannot give an inch to any dictator or wannabe dictator. So I think Chicago on September 1st at 11 a.m. in other places in the Haymarket, where the Haymarket martyrs fought for the labor movement, for labor conditions, for a 48-hour schedule, for minimum wage, for workers' rights, for dignified conditions, right? So it's important that we know that here in Chicago, it is a fight because Trump wants to take us back to normalize child exploitation. He wants to normalize pedophiles. He wants to normalize the very worst of our society. Those are the criminals that are now in charge. They're trying to cover up the Epstein files. They're trying to cover up the multiple crimes, and we will hold them accountable. So we are inviting all the press. I know that we have great presence, including Breakthrough News in the DNC. We invite you to come to document. They are not but experience in LA with organizations, sister organizations. We see how they're trying to intimidate people who documented. They can try to intimidate. They try to silence, but we must double down in those efforts. In Chicago on Labor Day, we want to launch our campaign of resistance to the dictator. We do not want kings. We don't want dictators. We are protecting each other. And we demand also that the Democratic Party, for once, step up and start denouncing the genocide, start denouncing the disappearing of immigrant communities. This is not new. We still have thousands of kids that they're still missing since the first Trump administration. So what we are doing is here in Chicago is to stand up, because we saw, like Martin Luther King said it well, if we can break the systems of oppression here in Chicago, we can do it in everywhere in the country, because we know how hard it is. We're also one of the most segregated cities in the country. And also we have a very, very hostile, very nasty set of billionaires. We have our own set of billionaires that are and corporations that are supporting the dictator. So the labor movement, the faith leaders, or working people are standing against the billionaires, against the fascists, against the dictator, to build a new future. And we believe that in Chicago, in LA, and DC, the resistance is alive and well, and we encourage everybody to resist, to get to the streets, to go to city councils, and to fight back for the world and the country that we truly believe in. We cannot continue to invade other countries and wonder why people are coming to police stations, that we just saw not too long ago in Chicago. We have 30,000 people in inhumane conditions that were left to sabotage the convention, right? So we believe that this is a moment of resistance. This is a moment of clarity and courage. We're not afraid of dictators. We're not afraid of billionaires. We are the working people, and the power of the people will, as Chairman Fred Hampton, this is the land of Fred Hampton. As Chairman Fred Hampton said it well, we must stop fascism, otherwise fascism will stop all of us.
That's a really, really good point. I appreciate that you mentioned something about the Democratic Party and what you just stated. And, I was watching the news today and I saw the mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, talking about, how the National Guard had been deployed by Donald Trump. And she was actually, I was surprised to see this. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised. She was pointing out that crime, since Trump has deployed the military into the streets of Washington, D.C., has gone down 15%. And I was just like, why on earth are you validating this? Especially as he's trying to launch this across the country. So I guess I'm curious because, it's a tough narrative to push back against, because that's why Republicans and Democrats, honestly, sometimes play on this, is because it's an easy way to use fear to get people to accept police state-like conditions. So how do you respond to this framing from apparently both Republicans and Democrats that this is actually reducing crime?
Mm-hmm. And that's a great, and I think that is important that in fact we condemn, and there's really a lot of connections between the forces that are justifying the genocide in Gaza, that are justifying those atrocities, and they seem to be normalizing or legitimizing these efforts. I mean, I'm talking about, for instance, people like Rahm Emanuel, right? Rahm Emanuel, we're talking about some of these elements of the Democratic Party that come and try to legitimize and think that these are the ways that we combat the issues of safety. It is clear that Trump does not care about safety, the safety of no one. So it is clear that the trend in our city, especially since we elected the first Black progressive mayor since the times of Mayor Washington. And you got to see, just like Zohran Mamdani in New York, we face tremendous opposition within the same party that legitimized. Today, I was in the call with some of my colleagues that was upset because I used the term fascist to refer to the dictator in chief. So these are the elements of within or the Democratic Party that are not given the clarity and the courage of the people of the moment. We cannot legitimize, using troops to create safety. How are children feeling safe going to DC schools when you have masked men awaiting for parents at the school door? How are we going to feel safer when we see neighbors being snatched from hospitals and churches in other cities? Well, here in Chicago, I think it's clear that we've been doing a lot of work to get to the root causes of violence, the disinvestments, and we push back on Governor Pritzker, for instance, that has been okay, for instance, with the narrative that we don't have money for public schools. Just like Trump says that has no money for public schools, the narrative gets convoluted and confusing. So we got to make sure that we, in our cities, and if we're leaders that want to step on the moment, lead to show that we've been able to reduce violent crime in Chicago because we invested in schools. We reopened mental health clinics. we were able to invest in the largest program of youth employment in the country. 31,000 youth work this summer in the city of Chicago. People from Black and brown communities that are often being neglected and dehumanized and criminalized. In the times of Rami Emanuel, let's remember, the Laquan McDonald, the atrocious shooting of the Chicago Police Department of Laquan McDonald. He shut down 50 public schools in the poorest areas of the city. It was a bloodbath. We have 7,000 Black youth who were interrogated and tortured during the Rami Emanuel years and before. So this is the past that we cannot come back to. So I feel that there's some, and I think that there's some elements of the party that want to take us back to those times because they think it's better than fascism. But I always have said neoliberals pave the way to fascists because they're dishonest. They don't tell the people the truth. And I'll challenge us to be truthful. Governor Pritzker has said this publicly. We want the media to tell the truth. And I second that. So let's take and tell the truth about what's going on in Gaza. And I challenge Governor Pritzker to be truthful about that, because we're not going to build coalition over a genocide, and we're not going to build a coalition around the dehumanization, criminalization of trans communities, immigrant communities, and working people, while the billionaire class, including Trump, who just made $3 billion out of the presidency and continues to protect rapists and criminals. He's the one who's protecting criminals, not the city of Chicago. So we're here in the city of Chicago. We're standing up to the dictator. We're saying we don't need any white supremacists to tell us what we need in a diverse city like us, that we know that what we need to do is invest in people. So we're demanding to Trump, give us our $800 million that you owe us because we paid for our violence prevention programs, the $200 million that he cut of our substance abuse programs, and they talk about that they are addressing the abuse of fentanyl, that they care about crime. They're the ones who are suffocating us and trying to fabricate a crisis. So I'm grateful that you give us this space to really tell about the truth, because one thing that we're not going to do, we have a united front, but we're very clear that we're not going to build a united front over genocide or the dehumanization, criminalization of anyone, including our immigrant communities, trans communities, Black and brown Palestinian communities.
Well, we were honored to give you this space, and we really appreciate you being willing to join us, and we will continue to document everything that people in Chicago are doing to stand up against this. Alderman Byron Chicho Lopez, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Rania?
Well, I don't know about you, Eugene, but he's got me fired up.
Yeah,
Let's
I know.
go.
Can I move to Chicago? Can I vote for him? Like, what
We
is?
need
What,
some
how
of
do I
that
do
energy.
that?
That was fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a
That was
lot of great work going on in Chicago. I think Trump, he might be surprised what he gets if he tries to keep pushing in that way. So we'll continue to cover it. We'll continue to follow it. And obviously shout out to a lot of people on the ground who send us a lot of great footage from Chicago, from a lot of the mass organizing and pushback on all these fronts, including against ICE. Well, we want to turn to another issue here that is right in front and center, of course, of Trump's takeover of Washington, D.C. and his broader orientation towards the country, and that is the criminalization of homelessness. And we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Brian Goldstone, who's the author of the fantastic There Is No Place for Us, Working and Homeless in America, that you have to read. Brian, thanks so much for coming back with us.
It's great to be back with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, great to have you here. And one thing, I mean, we've talked about the book before, but I've been thinking a lot about the book in the context of Trump's, both his executive order around homelessness, but specifically also the rhetoric around the takeover of D.C. And I was listening to this, Scott Turner, the HUD secretary, and he's like, we're going to finally give these people a hand up, not a handout, these cycles of dependency. And everything about it just seems so surreal if you know anything about homelessness in America, because they're just acting like people are just sort of like choosing to live on the streets and choosing not to accept help to get off the streets, and that it's like as simple as that. You flip a light switch, which just to me totally misunderstands the issue that we're dealing with.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think we need to be asking in the midst of all of this, who exactly profits from both obscuring the true causes of homelessness and from continuing to perpetuate these policies of criminalization and banishment and really, disappearing people? Like, who exactly is profiting from that narrative? And because to be clear, like, it is a narrative. It's a manufactured perception that what causes homelessness is, like addiction or mental illness, some other, personal pathology, individual choice. And that goes back to the 1980s with the emergence of mass homelessness under the Reagan administration. There was a concerted effort at that time to really hide from view the fact that it was the decimation of the social safety net, the gutting of low-income housing assistance, the gutting of public housing, just much like we're seeing today, the shredding of the safety net across various domains. And instead, what the public got was this propaganda campaign that said, oh, if you see people on the street, it's because they want to be there. Reagan actually used the term lifestyle choice. And so, what we're seeing today is more, I would argue, an intensification of that campaign than a departure from the status quo.
And okay, can you actually explain to us what specifically happened with regard to this Supreme Court ruling, which appears to ban people from sleeping outside? So I'm assuming that means you'd have a situation where you'd send the police off on homeless people basically and find them or maybe arrest them. I don't know. You can explain what that might mean. Maybe it's up to any city how they want to implement that. But it's quite cruel. And I believe that's even the case, banning people from sleeping outside, even if there's no other shelter available. So that's one. You have the Supreme Court ruling, and then you have, I think, a Trump executive order with regard to homelessness. So can you just explain what's happening with these two issues and how that might or will, I guess, play out? Because it is just really cruel and unusual.
Yeah, I mean, to frame this rightly around the Supreme Court ruling as a kind of milestone in at least the legal approach to addressing these issues is really important because the Supreme Court case was driven in many ways by Democrats as much as Republicans. Gavin Newsom infamously signed on to the case against the unhoused residents who were trying to fight these efforts originating in Grants Pass. The city council in Grants Pass was very transparent about their motives. They basically said, we just want to get people out of our city and just make them go somewhere else. So what this Supreme Court ruling was essentially doing was saying, prior to this, there was a case out of Boise that said that if a city doesn't have sufficient shelter space, you can't punish people for being outside. Like there's nowhere else for them to go. And cities like Grants Pass have been fighting that legal precedent. They've been saying, on the one hand, we don't want to build more shelter space. We don't want homeless people in our town or in our city. And we want to have the freedom to criminalize their behavior, to essentially criminalize them for the offense of not being able to afford rent in our city, not being able to afford housing. Because to be clear, that is what is driving this homelessness crisis, is a growing number of people who simply can't afford a place to live. So they were saying, we don't want to open shelters, we don't want to build affordable housing, and we want to have the right to punish these people and to get them out of the way. And that's what the Supreme Court gave cities and municipalities the green light to do. So Trump's executive order is really building off of that. I think there is a reckoning that needs to take place among self-styled progressives, people who avow human rights and just basic human decency, that like a lot of Democrats were supporting these measures, and that the abandonment of the poor and working class in this country, and then the criminalization of those people once they lose housing, has been a bipartisan phenomenon.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned at the outset who's really benefiting from this, because in the absence of these social supports, there's all these predatory industries that seem to be booming. And I was hoping you could talk about that. I mean, from the extended stay hotels to people you pay to co-sign for you. I mean, it seems like we've created this massive industry that is preying on people who, are in the most dire of circumstances.
Absolutely. I try to document in my book how at every turn in the journeys of the five families who I followed for several years for my book, at every turn in their journey, there were business models designed to profit off of their precarity, to exacerbate it, to make it go on and on and on, because there's a lot of money to be made off of their predicament. And yeah, I mean, what we see are private equity firms and Wall Street investors who are profiting at both ends. They are both buying up the housing that currently exists, the rental housing, and making that housing ever more precarious and insecure for those who occupy those homes by jacking up rents, by evicting people at several times the rate that like other landlords would. So they're profiting on that end. They're making the bottom line the sort of end all be all of owning these properties. But then perversely, they're also profiting off the very places that people are forced into once they lose their housing. And you mentioned the extended stay hotels. I mean, I was shocked to find that there's like this entire world of homelessness that exists out of sight, that again isn't just invisible, but is a kind of manufactured invisibility. And within that shadow realm, as I call it, the extended stay hotels and motels are a huge sort of node in that ecosystem. And during the pandemic, early in the pandemic, Blackstone and Starwood Capital, two private equity giants, they saw how much money can be made off buying up these places that people are forced to stay when they are pushed out of the formal housing market. And so they purchased Extended Stay America for $6 billion. So in other words, like homeless, I mean, because I call these hotels like extremely profitable homeless shelters. Homeless shelters themselves are becoming a new kind of investment frontier. And I think that just speaks to, we can extend that. We can extend that to the detention centers that are going up. Right now, we are poised as a country to spend roughly 4 times more on these new detention centers than was spent last year total on new affordable housing in America. So it needs to be said, 4 times as much on cages as on homes, and that is in the middle of an already devastating housing and homelessness emergency. So I mean, I just feel like that is that immediately raises the question, well, again, like who's making money off of those detention centers, and who is poised to make money off the free labor of the unhoused men and women who will invariably be forced into these places? I don't think it's alarmist to predict that.
It's so unbelievable and outrageous what you're describing. And, I think a lot of people are conditioned to believe, even if they, don't actually think it, it's just a general belief that's sort of groomed into us as Americans that like homelessness is some sort of, personal fault. It's a personal failure. Like you just don't have a job. You don't really try. It's just like lazy people. Or, to be most generous, it's like somebody who has really bad luck, but oh well. It will never happen to me or something. But at the end of the day, this criminalization of poverty or escalation of criminalization of poverty that you're describing, it's actually affecting people who have jobs. And that's something that you highlight quite a bit, is the fact that there are a significant portion of homeless people who work. They just cannot afford housing because housing is not a right. It's all about profit. So can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, in cities across America right now, a low-wage job is homelessness waiting to happen. That is the truth. And, I think one of the reasons why we as a society continue to perpetuate these myths and stereotypes about homelessness is to shield I was going to say ourselves, but it's really the oligarchs, those who are making the most money off of our economy today, who again, like, are invested in shielding scrutiny from the reality that the line between housed and unhoused in this country has just become brutally porous. And millions of people right now are one missed paycheck, one medical emergency, one rent hike away from being pushed into homelessness. Just to put some numbers on it, roughly 12.1 million renter households right now are classified as as severely cost burdened, which means they're paying more than half of their monthly income on rent alone. 12.1 million people. So, like, there's a pretty mammoth population that is at immediate risk of becoming unhoused, and so. Yes, I mean, the story that we have told ourselves as a country, that if you just work hard, like, a job is an exit from poverty, a job is an exit from this most severe form of deprivation, homelessness. We're seeing how false that story has been, and instead, what we're seeing are people who are working and working and working some more, and it simply is not enough to forget about getting rich, forget about owning a home. It's not even enough to secure the most basic human necessity, just a roof overhead. And instead, what we get is a narrative about homelessness, again, that vilifies and pathologizes those who are without homes. Just, if I could just add one more thing, it's that those who we see on the street, I argue, are only the tip of the iceberg. The tents, so to speak, are the tip of the iceberg. And in many ways, what my book tries to document is the vast iceberg that is under the water surface that we're not seeing, that is out of sight in these hotels, in people's vehicles, people who are sleeping in their cars in Walmart parking lots, people who are crowded into apartments with others. But it's important to note that it's all just one big iceberg. These are not like separate worlds or separate populations. The working homeless, so to speak, people who are on the street living in tents are also going to jobs in the morning. People who are living in encampments are also part of the labor force. And I show in my book how you can be in a hotel one day, you can be in your car tomorrow when you can't pay your rent at that hotel, and then in a couple of months you can be in a tent. So it's important that we understand homelessness not as this like terminal condition or a particular state that afflicts a particular kind of person, but rather as a spectrum of insecurity.
There is No Place for Us, Working and Homeless in America, critical book, one of the most important books, I think, out right now. Brian Goldstone, you are the author, and as always, we really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, what a sick, twisted kind of country where your priority is just to like slash any sort of help for people who have nothing, give more to people who have everything, and then criminalize. Literally, I mean, at this point, it's just you're going to get thrown into jail for being poor.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's where we're at.
Yeah.
That's where we're at.
No, I really encourage people to pick up Brian's book. I mean, I say it's one of my favorite books. I mean that obviously it's terrible situations that he's documenting, but the humanization of what's really going on and the context of the people he's chronicling, the families, I mean, it's both heartbreaking and amazing how resilient people are, but it just shows you how completely absurd the priorities are, as you say, Rania. Next, we want to go to something that you were able to do, I believe, earlier this week, and that is an interview with Valerie Zink, a photojournalist from Canada. Maybe if you want to say a little bit more to introduce this clip, Rania.
Yeah, so this week we all saw the Israelis killed another 5 journalists. Many of them were with Reuters. And many Reuters journalists have been killed by the Israelis since October 7th, including here in Lebanon. But of course, this was in Gaza. This was a bombing, a double tap strike on Nasser Hospital. And then after the Israelis murdered these 5 journalists, in addition to, I believe, like 15 other people, they then said that they were mistaken and that they had they called the camera that one of the journalists was holding a Hamas camera, that they had labeled a Hamas camera, and so that's why they targeted it. And what's wild here, Eugene, isn't the Israeli lie, because we're used to the Israelis lying, right? I mean, sometimes they take credit for killing journalists and call them Hamas operatives, also lies. In this case, they claimed they thought they were hitting a Hamas camera. Reuters releases a headline that basically has Israel's claim in the headline and in the article, saying that Israel targeted a Hamas camera. It was a Reuters camera. Like, it's actually insane. They were describing their own equipment as Hamas equipment. It's just the level of cowardice at this outlet to basically be complicit in covering up or in trying to justify the murder of your own journalists is so insane. So I'm not the only one who was outraged by this. Also, the woman who I interviewed, Valerie, has worked with Reuters for the past 8 years as a photojournalist. She was so disgusted by the way Reuters covered the murder of their own journalists that she publicly resigned and released a really lovely statement on Twitter in her resignation. And then she came on to Breakthrough News to talk about her resignation and how she feels about what's going on in Gaza, and specifically Israel's killings of journalists. So I'm very honored to be joined on the Freedom Side Live by Valerie Zink. She is a freelance photojournalist in Saskatchewan. Valerie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Rania.
Now, the reason we have you on is because you very publicly resigned from your work at Reuters, and you had a very important tweet where you put out a statement that's so good. And I'm just going to read the tweet part of it, and then we can talk a little bit more about what you said. But you tweeted, "I can't in good conscience continue to work for Reuters given their betrayal of journalists in Gaza and culpability in the assassination of 245 of our colleagues." And we're recording this a day after you posted that tweet that's now gone quite viral. And I think it says a lot that it's received so many likes and been reshared so many times. So Valerie, I just wanted to ask you, after 8 years at Reuters as a stringer, as you've said, you've made this I'm sure it was a difficult decision to publicly resign and protest over its role in, enabling Israel's killings, intentional murders of Palestinian journalists. So I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about, what was going through your mind here, and what was that final breaking point for you?
I mean, I've been outspoken about Palestine for many years now, including before I started working as a photojournalist. And I've been openly critical of Reuters' coverage and Western media's coverage of the genocide more generally. But the breaking point for me was really the assassination of Anas Al-Sharif and the Gaza City Al Jazeera crew. I'd been following Anas Al-Sharif throughout the genocide. I watched him when he took off his press vest after the ceasefire and was hoisted onto the shoulders of his colleagues and thinking that he'd survived, and I shared his plea for protection when it became clear that he was on an IDF hit list. And I read the final words and testament that he had written when he knew that he was going to die, and that just broke me. These are some of, I think, not just the best journalists that have ever lived. Like, these are the best human beings, and that loss to me is just unbearable. It's all unbearable, but I think at that point, I just couldn't conceive of having a relationship with Reuters any longer, reading their coverage of that story, dignifying this claim that these were not in fact journalists, they were members of the resistance and therefore had to die. It's reprehensible, I don't need to tell you that. And that was the point at which I made that decision. And, to be honest, I'm a freelancer in Western Canada. I don't cover international stories. Most of the stories that I cover about things like drought or particularly cold winters in the prairies, I didn't think anyone would really notice or care, to be honest. But I thought that if this was, something that would have meaning as a gesture of solidarity and of refusal, then it's the least that I could do.
I mean, I think it definitely made an impact. I mean, 23,000 retweets and 73,000 likes on a post that you probably didn't think would get that much traction, but it did, and it speaks to something. And just to point to the point you were making about the way Reuters covered Anas's killing, I believe it was the headline, right? It was something like Israel kills Al Jazeera journalist who they say is Hamas. It was like it was basically like that.
Exactly. And this is
Yeah.
typical, right? And we're seeing this even now after the bombing of Nasser Hospital, right? The headline is always the IDF statement, comma, Israel says, right? That's always what leads. That's always the framework. When there's zero evidence whatsoever to substantiate the zero independent investigation. And yeah, that's been longstanding even before the genocide. And
I just want to, sorry, about the killing you were just referencing was the 5 journalists that were killed. Many of them were Reuters journalists. And I actually didn't see Reuters coverage of that. Did they also do the same thing where it was like, Israel says, even though it was their own journalists?
Yeah, they've said, I mean, I forget, I don't have the exact headline in front of me right now, but it's, essentially saying that the strike was targeting a Hamas camera, Israel says, right? And I mean, what do we even say about that? Let's say that it was a Hamas camera, which it wasn't. Then you bomb a hospital and you kill 20 people to target a perfectly normal thing to do, no big deal. I mean, it's a travesty. It's unforgivable, right?
It absolutely is. And I also wanted to ask you, with regard to Reuters failing to essentially defend Anas, because by repeating Israeli lies about him, they're failing to defend him. And then you pointed out in your statement how his work won them a Pulitzer Prize. And then going so far as to dignify this Israeli propaganda after his murder. I guess I'm just curious your thoughts on what that says about the priorities of Western media when it comes to Palestinian lives specifically, even those working within their own institutions.
Yeah, I mean, we know that the priority of these institutions is to generate profit, right? That's their priority first and foremost, and they're driven by financial interests. They're driven by advertising, and that's how they're structured, right? They've never cared about Palestinian lives. They don't care about Black lives. They don't care about Indigenous lives. And regardless of the individual journalists working for these institutions, and I've heard from so many of them over the past 24 hours. More than I can count, including from Reuters, like despite their best intentions and efforts, those are subsumed by these structures that they work in, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm also just reminded, thinking of Reuters, that very early on after October 7th, it wasn't just Palestinian journalists. The Israelis targeted a convoy of journalists in the south of Lebanon, and they killed Reuters correspondent Issam Abdullah. And that was very early on. And also their coverage of that was very similar. Israel says, I mean, his family was very angry about that. It was a huge story here in Lebanon. Valerie, you described the Western media in the statement that you put on Twitter as a conveyor belt for Israeli propaganda, essentially helping to legitimize genocide. So, having been inside an outlet like Reuters at times for many, many years, I'm curious, why do you think so many outlets like Reuters are willing to abandon even the most basic journalistic standards when it comes specifically to this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I should say those are Jeremy Scahill's words from Dropsite News I quoted in my statement, but I think that they're bang on. I mean, the pressure is obviously immense on Western media, and I know certainly in Canada with organizations like Honest Reporting Canada, which is a registered charity here, incredibly, and swiftly mobilizes incitement campaigns of harassment and doxing against journalists who are even nominally critical of Israel. And then we see, subsequent retractions and apologies. Recently the Globe and Mail here just apologized for using the term forced starvation. No, actually it's a humanitarian crisis. There are many factors, right, following pressure on them. And I know, even on a small scale, where I live in Saskatchewan, I have friends who work as TV broadcasters, and if they have a story not even critical of Israel, just presenting kind of basic facts of what's happening in the genocide, they have people show up in person at the media offices, demanding to speak to management, essentially occupying offices and demanding retractions, demanding apology. So that pressure is immense. It's real. But again, I mean, these institutions are structurally designed to represent the interests of the powerful, and it's not just a matter of that pressure, but it certainly does play an important role, and that self-censorship is internalized, I think, and embedded in these institutions, particularly when it comes to Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, that's an insane amount. Just to imagine somebody coming in person and occupying an office until they get a retraction. You also said in the statement that you basically feel you can no longer wear a press pass without feeling some sort of deep shame and grief, and that you want to honor the courage of Palestinian journalists. And so I'm just curious, what does that look like for you moving forward? And as kind of a message to maybe other journalists who might be watching and having the same feelings that you're having, what would that sort of true journalistic solidarity with Gaza require, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's possible within these major media outlets. I know people are trying. They're not succeeding for the most part, as we're seeing. I don't know what that looks like other than abandoning them. I mean, certainly there's no shortage of incredible work that's happening in alternative media, breakthrough news, obviously, but so many examples, Electronic Intifada and Dropset, like there's incredible journalism that's happening outside of these big media institutions, and they deserve all of our support, and obviously amplifying the voices of journalists on the ground in Gaza as best we can. But, outside of journalism and media, I think we also have to be active in these movements, pushing for sanctions, pushing for an arms embargo. I mean, even in Canada, we're still sending weapons to Israel. We have to stop the genocide, not just report on it, not just talk about what's happening. We have to sever our ties. We have to stop our government's enabling of this to continue.
Valerie, I want to thank you so much, first of all, for what you did in speaking out, but also for joining us here on the Freedom Side Live. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, Rania. It's my honor.
Valerie Zink, the journalist from Canada, for joining us and doing all that. Great interview. Great job, Rania.
Yeah, I was really impressed with her. And also, I mean, look, there's a lot of people like her who work inside of these institutions. In her case, I mean, she freelanced for Reuters for many years, and they hate what's happening. She has been outspoken, by the way. It's something that she has spoken out against the genocide in Gaza repeatedly, but this public resignation for her was just a way to make some noise against the media's complicity in Israel's killing of journalists. And at this point, I hope more people do that. I really do. Because I'm not sure what else to do to hold these media outlets accountable. It's just disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. Over 250 people, journalists in Gaza, have been murdered in the course of 2 years, intentionally so. And actually, I want people to keep an eye out on this channel, because I do have an episode of Dispatches coming out about the murder of a Palestinian journalist, and a documentary that was made about it. And one of her family members is also the documentary filmmaker and a family member who I interviewed for this episode. And it's basically focused on Israel's playbook for how they get away with murder and the U.S. complicity in it. So here we are.
Yes. Well, before we get out of here, Rania, I was hoping you could enlighten us on the latest in your nation, Lebanon, one of your nations. You, of course, are also Lebanese American. I don't want to give Nova any slight, but Tom Barak, one of the Trump's many envoys, just is there. I believe Jeanne Shaheen is there, the senator from New Hampshire, came with him in his delegation. Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina. Morgan Ortagus, who's now the deputy special envoy for affairs, but was also stationed in Lebanon for some time. And it seems that this delegation has made many waves in many different ways, but especially Barak, with some very offensive comments he made about the press in Lebanon and in West Asia and the Middle East more broadly. So, give us a sense of, we know we've talked a couple times before about the U.S. pressure on Lebanon, the attempts to disarm Hezbollah, to impose, sort of the imperial writ even deeper. So where does this fit in all of that? And why is this causing some ructions and waves?
Well, so all of the people that you just mentioned, and I think Joe Wilson was a part of that delegation as well.
Jesus.
Crazy Joe Wilson. Yeah. They were in Lebanon this
worse.
week. We're in Lebanon this week, and Tom Barrack is the special envoy to the region, I guess, is like what he's become. Initially, I think he was the ambassador to Turkey. Also, this guy, Tom Barrack, he's basically like a real estate mogul. Who was a former fundraiser for Donald Trump, like way back in, 2016, 2017. And actually at one point he was arrested and basically like put on trial for being an agent of the United Arab Emirates, though he was acquitted of all those charges.
Yep.
But that's shady enough, right? He also is of Lebanese descent. So since, Morgan Ortagus was in his position before, now he's taken that position and he's basically been America and Israel's envoy, you could say, to try to push this idea of disarming Hezbollah in Lebanon. And so he came with a gang of Americans this week to basically take a victory lap about the idea of disarmament. I had explained on a previous episode of Freedom Sides Live what was happening around that the Americans were basically giving the Lebanese government no other option but to disarm Hezbollah or basically like face, some further strangulation that they've already experienced. And there are people in power in Lebanon, Prime Minister Nawaf Salem and the President Joseph Aoun, who are complying with the Americans and basically doing their bidding. And rather than, protecting their people from a country, the Israelis, who continue to occupy 5 points in southern Lebanon, I think they've actually maybe even expanded to 8, refused to allow people to come back and have committed over 4,000 ceasefire violations, including, by the way, today when they killed 2 Lebanese army soldiers in Naura in southern Lebanon. Rather than respond to the Israelis or protect their people, these people in charge of Lebanon that I just described are complying with the Americans and are putting together a plan to get the Lebanese army to disarm Hezbollah, which could lead to civil war. And anyways, all that background to say, this week we have this delegation of members of Congress, from Lindsey Graham to Joe Wilson to Jeanne Shaheen, joined by Morgan Ortagus and Tom Barrack, coming to Lebanon, and they go to do a press conference, and there's a scrum of Lebanese journalists getting ready to ask their questions. And so let's show this clip of what Tom Barrack said as these Lebanese journalists are, in a, huddled together, ready to ask their questions.
And I want to tell you something. The moment that this starts becoming chaotic, like animalistic, we're gone. So you want to know what's happening? Act civilized, act kind, act tolerant, because this is the problem with what's happening in the region. So I beg you, do you think this is fun for us? Do you think this is economically beneficial for Morgan and I to be here putting up with this insanity?
Why do you need Israel to tell you to disarm Hezbollah? That's not Israel's decision, that's yours decision. Whether they withdraw or not, it depends on what you do. So don't tell me anymore, we're not going to disarm Hezbollah until Israel does something. If that's the model, you're going to fail. The reason you disarm Hezbollah, because it's best for you. This country is going backward, not forward, if you don't follow through with disarming the Palestinians and Hezbollah and making the Lebanese army the central repository of arms for the nation. If you don't do that, you're going nowhere.
What has Israel implemented from the ceasefire agreement?
Again, we're not going to address questions about what Israel's doing because I haven't been part of those discussions.
What has Israel implemented from the ceasefire agreement?
The senator has already responded to that question. We'll do one more question for this delegation and then we'll move on.
I'm not part of those discussions, so I'm not going to speak to them.
So that is, I think it was important to show what the others said as well, because these people are just, the imperial hubris is ridiculous. You come to Lebanon, a country that is constantly being bombed by the Israelis, over 4,000 ceasefire violations. You demand the government basically either start a civil war by forcing the Lebanese army to disarm Hezbollah, without any guarantees Israel will stop those violations, or else basically they'll unleash another Israeli war on Lebanon. And the U.S. will sanction Lebanon and strangle it further than it's already being strangled. It's really mafia-like behavior. And Eugene, they are giving zero guarantees. The Israelis don't have to do anything. They just want Hezbollah to disarm while Israel continues to kill people and bomb this country almost every single day. Meanwhile, they've now introduced a new mechanism because Israel is demanding that the border villages that were destroyed, that they refused to leave from, that people not return. They do not want these villages repopulated. Instead, they're promoting this idea that the area would be designated some sort of economic zone with I don't even know, factories or something. I'm not even sure what that means, an economic zone. But eventually that's just a way of saying a buffer zone between these Lebanese villages that have now been depopulated and the Israelis who live across the border. So this is Israel's way of forcing a buffer zone and not giving back Lebanese land, continuing to occupy it, because as far as Israel's concerned, Lebanese population is the problem. Because if you have Lebanese people living on the border, their mere existence there is a threat, especially if you want to steal and settle their land. So it's just completely insane. Meanwhile, Hezbollah, I want to say, has not violated the ceasefire a single time. And they have insisted that any conversation about their arsenal of weapons has to be tied to a broader strategy of national defense. They're not going to disarm if there is no ability of the state to defend or protect themselves, which, seems pretty logical. But again, this is like a one-sided conversation. The Americans are coming in and saying, get rid of your weapons, basically completely submit. And the Israelis, by the way, we won't stop them from still bombing you and stealing your land. And sadly, there are Lebanese people this week who we know when all these people came, they were treated to beautiful dinners and red carpet treatment, and Morgan Ortegas had her hair done and made this really cringy video getting her hair done at some fancy salon. And, everything was going fine and dandy for them because there's a chunk of the Lebanese population that really does believe if only we just get rid of Hezbollah's weapons, everything here will be great. Let's be on the American side. The Americans are great. Morgan Ortegas is so pretty and cool. Look at her hair. And Tom Barrack, they were all fanboying and fangirling over Tom Barrack because he's so suave. And then he comes and makes these comments, animalistic, uncivilized. That's the problem with the region. Completely unprovoked because the people in the press pool want to ask questions. And of course, people are making the point. It became a big conversation in Lebanon. And they were right to say this. You want to talk about animalistic? You guys are the barbarians here. Look at what you're doing in Gaza. Look at what you did to South Lebanon. Look what you're doing in Syria. Look what you did to Libya. Look what you did to Iraq. Who are the animals here? Anyway, so there was a huge uproar, and maybe it was a good reminder for people in Lebanon that these are not your friends. They see you as animals. And so Tom Barrack was forced to respond to his disgusting and racist comments. And again, Tom Barrack of Lebanese descent. So there was also this kind of attitude of he's a successful Lebanese. He's kind of like one of us. We can trust him. And then he made these comments. And so he was asked about them in an interview that came out today. And I think we have that clip. Do we have that clip?
Well,
animalistic was a word that I didn't use in a derogatory manner. I'm just saying, can we calm down? Can we find some tolerance, some kindness? Let's be civilized. But it was inappropriate to do when the media is just doing their job. I understand more than anybody else. These things get complicated and difficult, and it's very rare that they have an opportunity to talk to people who actually are making the decision. So they have the illusion that that's me. I should have been more generous with my time and more tolerant myself.
He didn't mean it as derogatory, Eugene. It wasn't derogatory.
Just came out.
He was just Yeah, he was just telling people to calm down. He wasn't trying to be derogatory. I mean, I don't even know who's going to buy that BS excuse. I mean, that was, obviously, like, he sat down and played the PR game and said, okay, I should just go ahead and apologize and sound sincere. But at the end of the day, I think that was actually, I'm glad he said what he said. I think it was a really great reflection, an honest reflection of how the Americans view this region and the people in it, even the ones who adore the Americans. Submission does not give you a successful, prosperous country. There are examples of that across the third world, and half this country is still living with destroyed houses. A huge portion of this country is still living under Israeli bombs. And this guy is coming with his smile and pretending to be on Lebanon's side when he's just doing America and Israel's bidding. And at the end of the day, we are animals to him.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's 100% right. I couldn't say it better than that. And I think when you look at the reality of Lebanon since, some time, but certainly World War I, mean, this has been the attitude of the Americans and the Europeans from the very beginning. No sovereignty, neo-colonialism, and empowering their own, satrapies in a divide and rule type scenario. So I think that's very well put. The only final thing I would say is unbelievable that Jean Shaheen would say, I can't comment on Israel because I haven't been in the discussions. Not only is she a member of the Committee on Foreign Relations in the Senate, she's a member of the subcommittee that deals specifically with this region. So if they aren't talking about one of the main factors in the overall issue of why are you even there? I mean, obviously she's just lying and saying that because she doesn't even want to say it, but just the level of just ignorance that implies. One of the main issues dealing with the country that I am currently in, where I am allegedly coming to represent a country that is directly related to my portfolio in the Senate, yet I know nothing about it and cannot comment. The level of just extreme just ignorance that you could display. But when you're in that scenario, as you point out, where you're the imperial ruler, you can say and do whatever you want to do, treat people however you want to treat them, and it is what it is. But ultimately, those things tend to backfire on you, as we've seen from many, many imperial rulers across the years. And I think the Joe Wilsons, Jean Shaheens, Lindsey Grahams, Tom Burks, and Morgan Ortegases of the world, the roulette wheel is going to stop eventually, and it's not going to land on what they betted. But thank you for that update. Yeah, please.
No, I just want to add one thing. I mean, it's the Americans have done something that has been obviously detrimental to the region, and they do it to one country after another, where they basically put together these little puppet governments and armies that just do America's bidding. And it's like little Palestinian authorities everywhere. And that's what they're doing to Lebanon right now. They are trying to turn the Lebanese army into a tool of the Americans to not just disarm Hezbollah, but essentially stop anybody from fighting for their rights and their land against Israeli aggression, just like the Palestinian Authority does across the West Bank. And it's so sad. And they've done it to Syria as well, with these people that are in power in Syria now. I mean, just yesterday, there was this unprecedented Israeli raid outside of Damascus where they actually commandos landed. They bombed and then landed from a helicopter, and killed a bunch of soldiers, Syrian soldiers. And there was zero response from the Syrians, because that's what their army does now. They don't exist to defend their people, their territory from outside aggression. They're just too busy massacring minorities on the coast and in Sweden. And then, you have these client regimes in places like Egypt and Jordan that are just such wildly effective police states that people can't, even look at Israel the wrong way without getting arrested or disappeared on behalf of, for the Americans, and on and on and on. And it's just a really, really sad state of affairs. I don't think it's a sustainable solution for the long run for the Americans. I think it can work for some time, but not in the long run, because at the end of the day, those who are impacted, in their daily lives aren't just going to sit back and be stomped all over. They're eventually going to fight back because they don't have any other choice. But yeah, the Americans are definitely doing a victory lap right now. Lindsey Graham, Morgan Ortegas, Tom Barrack, I think they're doing a preemptive victory lap. And I think they've got another thing coming if they think it's going to be some sort of cakewalk where they can just get the Lebanese army to go and take weapons away from Lebanese people who are trying to defend their land. They have nothing else to do it for them because the state has abandoned them.
Well, we are going to leave it there for today. Big shout out, of course, to everyone who followed us and stayed with us throughout the show. Rania, before we get out of here, are there things you would like our viewers to know?
Well, I'd always like our viewers to know that it is almost midnight my time, so forgive me for my stumbles. I get really tired at night. I'm an early sleeper. So I stumbled a few times this episode. I usually do better, and I apologize. But you know what? One way I'll do even better is if we have more people supporting the show, because that's what keeps us going and growing. And then maybe we can even have like more live streams at different times of the day when I can be more awake. So if you appreciate our work here at Breakthrough News, with and without the stumbles, please go to patreon.com/breakthroughnews and become a member for as little as $5 a month, where you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch. And also, I just want to wish everybody a happy Labor Day weekend. I know it's like America Labor Day, not the rest of the world Labor Day, but it is the one we get in the U.S. So happy Labor Day, happy weekend to all of those workers out there. You deserve more time off than just a Monday.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, patreon.com/breakthrough news. Of course, big thanks to all of our guests, everyone who is a viewer, our existing patrons. For myself, for Rania, for the whole Breakthrough News team, we will see you next time.